Hey beauties and beasts, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the darker corners of human psychology. So grab your skincare, your drinks, and get comfy because today's story is a really strange one. So tonight we're heading to Russia, 2011. A quiet apartment, worried parents force open their son's door and find 29 bodies, all dressed up, sitting around like a family. Some watching TV, some tucked into bed, some at the dinner table. But here's the twist. This wasn't a serial killer. This was a genius, a historian who spoke 13 languages, a respected academic. Some neighbors called him polite and brilliant. So what happened? How does a mind like that create something so horrifying? This is the story of Anatoly Moskvin, the man they called the Lord of the Mummies, the man who believed he was saving the dead by bringing them home. So let's get into it. In the fall of 2011, a strange video appeared on a Russian internet forum. A shaky handheld camera, dim lighting. Someone was filming the inside of their home. From the very first frame, something felt off. The wallpaper was peeling in several places, and the floor was scattered with unidentifiable objects. Even through the screen, you could almost smell the staleness seeping out. The atmosphere was eerie, mysterious. As the camera slowly panned across the living room, it caught sight of something sitting on the sofa. A doll, or at least what looked like a doll. It was life-sized, about the height of a young girl dressed in a bright pink dress, white stockings, and shiny shoes, sitting neatly as if waiting to be invited to a party. Then the camera turned toward the dining table, where another doll sat. This one wore a bear mask over its head, and on the cupboard, on the chair beside the bed, dozens more dolls filled every corner of the apartment. People who saw the video at first just laughed, a weird doll collector, some said. Others dismissed it as bizarre art or mocked it as a perverted hobby. But a few days later, all of Russia was horrified because those weren't dolls. They were people who had once been alive. November 2011 at Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. It was an ordinary afternoon. A couple went to check on their son, Anatoly, whom they hadn't heard from in a while. They knocked, rang the bell, but no answer. Just as they were about to leave, a strange smell drifted out from the gap beneath the door. What's that smell? It was unfamiliar, sickly sweet, yet rotten. With growing unease, they forced the door open. A wave of damp, heavy air poured out from the dark interior. And there, in the middle of the living room, something was sitting. A small body wrapped in cloth, a face covered in wax, wearing a pink dress shaped like a young girl. They turned toward the wall, and they found more of them. On the chair, beside the bed, on top of the cupboard. Large and small figures, as detailed as real people, filled the entire apartment. And they were all just sitting like humans. Anatoly, what is this? The terrified parents immediately called the police. Officers arrived and began to inspect the scene, quickly sealing off the apartment. As detectives lifted each doll, they noticed something strange about the texture. The surface felt dry, like shrunken human skin. And beneath the fabric came the faint, brittle sound of bone scraping bone. And tests later confirmed the unthinkable. They were not dolls. They were the mummified remains of real girls and young women, aged between 3 and 29. Forensic analysis in Moscow revealed that most bodies had been preserved with special chemicals, and some still carried the sharp smell of formaldehyde. In the small 3-room apartment, police discovered a total of 29 mummified bodies. But the horror didn't end there. In Moskvin's storage room, investigators found piles of metal nameplates, gravestone fragments he had pried off and collected as mementos. He had desecrated more than 150 graves across the region. So the question emerged, who was the owner of this nightmarish house? Anatoly Yuryevich Moskvin, age 45 at the time. He was a renowned Russian historian and linguist. He was arrested on the spot. The police report written immediately after his arrest read, "The interior of the scene was beyond words. It was terrifying. Each doll was dressed like a living girl, with ribbons in their hair. None of us could have imagined that death was hiding beneath them." Russia was shaken to its core. This was not a simple case of grave robbery. It was a grotesque exhibition staged by a man with a deeply twisted soul. And neighbors remembered Anatoly Moskvin this way. He was very quiet, always polite, and well-mannered. People called him a genius. His intellect was extraordinary. When it became known that 29 mummified bodies had been found in his home, the entire neighborhood was in disbelief. Moskvin was a nationally respected historian and linguist. He could speak 13 languages fluently, and he had earned a doctorate in history for his work decoding ancient Russian manuscripts, particularly focusing on Celtic history and folklore. His academic papers were highly praised, and local universities and museums regarded him as a symbol of intellect. He kept a personal library of over 60,000 books and documents on death, burial rituals, and the occult. He worked as a lecturer in Celtic studies and regularly contributed to local newspapers as a journalist. He dubbed himself an necropolist, an expert on cemeteries, and one colleague called his work priceless. But that very same man had been roaming graveyards for years, digging up the graves of young girls and women. When questioned, Moskvin spoke calmly to the police. "Over the past 10 years, I have visited more than 700 cemeteries. I walked 30 kilometers a day, always at night." But here's what made his crimes even more disturbing. His obsession had been enabled by legitimate work. From 2005 to 2007, a publisher commissioned Moskvin to catalog and document 752 cemeteries across 40 regions of Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. He was paid to walk through graveyards, take detailed notes, and research the histories of those buried there. During these expeditions, he sometimes slept in coffins awaiting funerals, or haystacks, or directly on graves. He drank water from puddles and spent nights alone among the dead. This work gave him both the access and the knowledge he needed to select his victims. He would then bring the bodies home and transform them. He carefully cleaned the remains using a combination of salt and baking soda to dry and preserve them. He would cache the bodies in secure, dry locations near cemeteries, waiting for them to mummify naturally. Once dried, he wrapped the limbs in cloth strips and stuffed the body cavities with rags and paddings to provide fullness. He covered faces with plaster and wax masks, decorated with nail polish, inserted artificial eyes, and dressed them in colorful gowns, ribbons, stockings, and shoes. Inside some of the bodies, he placed music boxes, hospital tags, gravestone fragments, and other mementos. One corpse even contained a dried human heart. What emerged from his hands were what he believed to be restored versions of dead children and young women, dolls resurrected in his own way, with functional bodies they could use when he eventually discovered how to bring them back to life through science or magic. Each doll bore the real name engraved on the original gravestone. He talked to them every day, celebrated their birthdays, and seated them at the table to eat together. He said, "I took care of them so they wouldn't feel lonely. I loved them." And neighbors were dumbfounded. Moskvin had always seemed normal, polite, sociable, and never unstable. He subscribed to daily newspapers, wrote academic papers, and lived like an ordinary citizen. Or at least, that is how he made himself appear. But there is something even more chilling that the investigation revealed. Moskvin's parents lived with him in the same 3-room apartment. They knew about the figures, but they believed them to be large, elaborate dolls that their eccentric son had collected. They had no idea they were sharing their home with 29 corpses. And Moskvin's madness didn't begin overnight. The story goes back to 1979 when he was a 13-year-old boy. One day, walking home from school, young Anatoly encountered a funeral procession for an 11-year-old girl named Natasha Petrova. Suddenly, strange men in suits stopped him. According to Moskvin's own account, written years later in the obituary newspaper Necrologies, an adult pushed my face down to the waxy forehead of the girl in an embroidered cap, and there was nothing I could do but kiss her as ordered. But the ritual didn't end there. Natasha's grieving mother placed a wedding ring on the dead girl's finger, and another on Moskvin's finger, symbolically marrying them. I kissed her once, then again, Moskvin wrote. My strange marriage with Natasha Petrova was useful. At that moment, he said, a strange thrill ran through him. He wrote, her forehead was cold, but it felt somehow alive. Now, it's important to understand the cultural context here. In Russian Orthodox tradition, kissing the dead is not unusual. It's a normal part of funeral customs. Mourners circle the open coffin counterclockwise and kiss the deceased hands, forehead, or body as a final farewell. Bodies are traditionally displayed in homes for 3 days before burial, often on the dining table, and visitors come to pay their respects. Russians also believe the soul lingers for 40 days, with special commemorations on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death. So the act of kissing a corpse wasn't inherently traumatic for a Russian child. What was traumatic and bizarre was the forced marriage ritual imposed by grieving adults, creating a psychological bond between a living boy and a dead girl. That brief, strange experience changed Moskvin's life forever. For the first time, he felt death not as something to fear, but as something beautiful and alluring. From that day on, he often wandered near cemeteries, and at night, he would sometimes sleep beside gravestones. In his diary, he later wrote, I heard the dead calling out to me. They whispered that they were lonely, begging me not to forget them. As he entered adolescence, he began to lose the line between reality and fantasy. To him, cemeteries were no longer places of death. They became gardens where sleeping children rested, waiting for someone to awaken them. As an adult, Moskvin never married. He never dated. He lived with his parents, abstained from alcohol and smoking, and dedicated himself to his university work and research. But deep down, there was only one thing he truly desired: to raise a daughter. So he applied for adoption, but as a single, unmarried man, he was rejected. And that rejection marked the turning point where his longing became obsession, and his obsession turned into madness. He later wrote, they refused me. All I wanted was to love a child, to take care of her. After being denied adoption, he began visiting cemeteries more often. He would sit before the graves of young girls and whisper to them, "It's all right, I'll take you home." And to him, those words weren't just comfort, they were a promise. And years later, he fulfilled that promise in the most horrifying way imaginable. For Moskvin, death was not the end. It was merely the beginning. And so Anatoly Moskvin's House of Death was born. His apartment, an old 3-room building, was shrouded in perpetual darkness. The curtains were always drawn, almost no sunlight ever came in. To him, this home was everything: a laboratory, a tomb, and above all, a family dwelling. A family made of the dead. He gave each of his dolls a name: Natalia, Anya, Katya. He remembered their birthdays and baked small cakes for each one, placing them neatly on the table. Next to each cake lay a handmade paper card that read, "Happy birthday, my beloved daughter. Daddy is always by your side." Every morning, he greeted his dolls as if they were alive. "Did you sleep well? Today, we should study." And every evening, he played classical music, sat at the dining table, and ate dinner with them. He would often tell himself, "Now I finally have a perfect family." One entry in his diary read, "They needed me. I gave those children a new life." When investigators examined the apartment, they found a TV playing cartoons in one corner, with several dolls seated in chairs, positioned as though they were watching. Some dolls were tucked into bed, under blankets, while others stood by the window, gazing outside. Each figure had been arranged carefully, as if following the natural movements of real people in a household. In an interview, Moskvin said, "I never harmed them. I only gave them peace. They were my friends, my daughters." And here's something important that's often confused about this case. Moskvin was not a necrophiliac in the classical sense. There is no evidence he engaged in sexual acts with the bodies. His crimes were not driven by sexual desire. So classic necrophilia involves sexual attraction to or acts with corpses. What Moskvin suffered from was something different. A complex combination of paranoid schizophrenia, extreme attachment disorder, and delusional beliefs about resurrection. His love for these bodies was rooted in pathological loneliness and a desperate need for family and companionship, not sexual gratification. So he truly believed he was caring for them, that he would one day resurrect them through science or magic, and that he was giving them the love and attention their families had abandoned by burying them. When confronted by the families of his victims, Moskvin showed no remorse and profound lack of empathy. "You abandoned your girls. I brought them to life and warmed them up. They buried their daughters, and this is where I believe their rights over them finished." In 2011, Anatoly Moskvin was arrested on charges of grave desecration and corpse theft, but the court concluded that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. A psychiatric evaluation determined he had paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness characterized by delusions and loss of touch with reality. But he was never sentenced to prison. Instead, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital, where he remains under constant medication and supervision. In November 2020, authorities declared his schizophrenia cured, but the judge extended his psychiatric commitment by 6 months. And as of recent reports, he remains institutionalized, with authorities expressing concern that he might reoffend if released. But the ones who suffered most were not him, but the families of the stolen children and young women. One grieving parent said through tears at a press conference, "We lost our daughter once, but he forced us to say goodbye a second time." The Russian public was shaken. Two sides of one man, a brilliant scholar and a maker of corpse dolls, coexisting in a way that should never have been possible. But in his final statement, Moskvin said only this: "I loved them. Is that really such a crime?" Yet his love was nothing more than a desecration, a disturbance of the peace that the dead deserved, a violation of grieving families' right to mourn, and a blasphemy against the quiet rest of souls. His case raises chilling questions about the nature of genius and madness, about loneliness so profound it creates an alternate reality, and about the thin line between intellectual brilliance and complete detachment from humanity. Anatoly Moskvin remains one of Russia's most disturbing criminal cases, not just because of violence or cruelty, but because of the profound delusion that convinced a brilliant mind that stealing and mummifying the dead was an act of love. So, what do you think? Do you think this was love? a deeply lonely man, twisted by mental illness, who genuinely believed he was rescuing these girls from abandonment. A brilliant mind so detached from reality that he couldn't see the horror of what he'd done. Or was he a monster who killed them twice? First, by stealing their rest, and then by robbing their family's closure and peace. It's not an easy question, and honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer. The human mind is capable of such beautiful things and such darkness. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think Moskvin deserves sympathy or only condemnation? Okay, that's a wrap for today, and until next time, sleep well, or try to. Anyways, bye.